This is the personal research tool. It's a simple 3-column form that will help you discover why you repeatedly choose a path that takes you to unwanted outcomes. To see how it works, let's use it to attempt to solve Mimi's puzzle. We'll start with the column on the right to record her emotional reaction. When her husband did not arrive home at the expected time, she first experienced fear. Fear that he'd been in an accident, and fear that he was having an affair. She rated her fear as 60 on the 100-point scale. But the fear turned to anger, and the more time elapsed without hearing from him, the more she thought about infidelity, and the angrier she became. She rated her anger at 100 out of 100. The left column is for the stimulus that triggered the reaction. He did not arrive at the expected time and did not call. Now, because we're researching cause and effect from the perspective of a dispassionate observer, we can analyze it more carefully than Mimi usually does. She tends to attribute her emotional reactions to the triggering event. For example, I was angry because he was late, and that's true as far as it goes. But that understanding doesn't contain the critical information she needs to cope with these kinds of provocations in the future. The whole point of researching the causes of a problem is to solve the problem, so you don't keep on making the same mistake again and again. To govern herself, that is, to respond mindfully during high-risk situations, she'll have to understand the effective cause of her emotional reactions. But it won't reveal itself. She'll have to look for it by researching the space between the stimulus and her reaction. If she doesn't go beyond, I was angry because he was late, she'd miss the critical information that explains why she became so angry. After all, not everyone becomes that angry in response to the same nominal stimulus. So there must be something causing Mimi to react so intensely to a triggering event that other people take in stride. And whatever the source of her reaction is, it lives in the space between the stimulus and her response. And until she solves the puzzle of what happens in that space, she's bound to react the same way the next time she runs into a similar situation. And the solution to Mimi's puzzle, and as you may have guessed, the solution to your puzzle, lies in the space between the event that happened and your reaction to it. And that brings us to the heart of the personal research tool. The event that happened is the nominal cause of her reaction, but the effective cause is her interpretation of that event. Several people could experience the identical event and yet react to it very differently. Why? Because each interprets the event differently. To understand what causes Mimi to react as she does, we have to understand how she interprets the event that happened. So let's you and I collaborate with Mimi to see if we can discover the actual cause of her unwanted reaction. The middle column includes some standard questions that will help her examine the space between the stimulus and her response to it. Now understand this. We are not looking for the rational, healthy analysis of what happened, but the interpretation that caused Mimi to react as she did. So the task of the first-person researcher is to record your recollections of the thoughts and images that went through your mind when you experienced the triggering event. And if you like, you can probe deeper by asking yourself follow-up questions. What does this event say about me? What does it mean about my life, my future? What was I afraid could happen? What does it mean about how this person, Jerry in Mimi's case, thinks about me? What does it mean about Jerry in general? What images or memories does this situation trigger? Now you can always go deeper by probing the space through follow-up questions, such as, if this interpretation is valid, what does that say about me, the other person, or the future? So let's collaborate with Mimi as she probes the space between the event that happened and her reaction to it. She's now jotting down the first thing that comes to her mind when she asks herself these questions. Remember, we're not seeking the most rational or valid interpretation of the triggering event, but the interpretation that elicits the self-sabotaging reaction. Often the first sloppy thought evoked by a probe is the most useful for our purposes. So when you do yours, write as fast as you can and don't edit. Returning to Mimi's personal research, in the space between the stimulus and the response are several interpretations of the stimulus that could be the effective cause of the response. For this illustrative example, we'll have to choose the leading candidate in the absence of direct experience to guide us. When you do your research, you'll be looking for the interpretation that elicits the strongest emotional experience. When I collaborate with clients, seeking to understand what causes them to react so intensely when their partner acts in a way that might be quite innocent, we usually conclude that the intense reaction is a consequence of interpreting the nominal stimulus as an indication that the partner is going to abandon them. Mimi listed a couple of versions of this. Let's say she chooses, he'd rather be with someone else than with me. And so we'll make this the leading candidate by circling it in red. We don't know whether this interpretation is valid or not, and we're on Mimi's side, so if Jerry is likely to be unfaithful, he's getting what's coming to him, and we want Mimi to do whatever it takes to protect herself. If, on the other hand, Mimi's interpretation is not valid, then her angry but mistaken accusations may lead to an outcome that she doesn't want. Now, mistakes happen, and when they do, researching their cause helps you discover why you made them, so you don't repeat them. According to our research, the cause of Mimi's mistake was her interpretation of an ambiguous nominal stimulus. Specifically, she interpreted Jerry's staying late at the office to his presumed preference for his secretary's companionship than for Mimi's. But Mimi's history of failed relationships goes back to before she met Jerry. Her recurring pattern of excessive emotional reactions has damaged all of her previous romantic relationships. And the cause for that recurring pattern is her biased way of viewing the actions of her intimate partner. Each time she interprets their actions, she's viewing them through the lens that distorts her interpretation. Attributing Jerry's tardiness to his preference for hanging out with his secretary is only one of the many possible interpretations of that nominal stimulus. Mimi feels certain that her interpretation is valid, but based on the evidence she has, it's premature. Another label for a premature judgment is a prejudice. Mimi's recurring pattern of unwanted outcomes is the result of the same prejudice that causes her to interpret Jerry's lateness as she does. She interprets such nominal stimuli differently than would dispassionate observers, including her therapist or her supportive aunt or uncle. The same bias that distorts Mimi's interpretation of Jerry's actions distorts her interpretations of the actions of any intimate partner. As a rule of thumb, if the lens distortion or prejudice produces an excessive reaction, it will show up as a recurring pattern of excessive reactions. This systematic bias of her interpretation of the actions of her intimate partner is the key to solving Mimi's puzzle. The personal research tool can help her access that key, just as it can reveal the solution to your puzzle. In Mimi's case, the premise that underlies the interpretation she listed in the middle column is, I'm not good enough, and so I've circled that in blue. Sometimes it's easier to see the cause of and solution to someone else's problem than your own. Doing this personal research enables Mimi to look at her problem from the perspective of a dispassionate observer. From a distance, she can see that her default interpretation that Jerry would rather spend time with his secretary than with me is only one of several plausible interpretations of the information available to her. If it is valid, then her anger and threats of divorce are justified. But if that's all the data she has to go on, her judgment is premature. But Mimi doesn't think her judgment is premature. She is certain that something is going on between Jerry and his secretary, so she attributes her reaction to the nominal stimulus. Mimi is blind to what is so obvious to the dispassionate observer, namely that there are several plausible interpretations of the nominal stimulus, and Mimi's reaction results from her particular interpretation. No doubt, most people in Mimi's position would judge Jerry's no-call and no-show for dinner as inconsiderate, and many might get angry with him. But Mimi's particular reaction results from her particular interpretation. The effective cause of her reaction is not Jerry's actions per se, but Mimi's speculation that his action meant that he'd rather spend time with his secretary than with her. Exploring the space between the triggering event and her reaction to it can give Mimi a deeper understanding of why she reacted so intensely in this situation. And our first use of the personal research tool yielded a working hypothesis about what caused her excessive reaction, the interpretation circled in red. But this knowledge by itself is not the solution to Mimi's puzzle. Her problem is not just that she acts counter to her own interests, but that she does it again and again. In contrast to other domains of her life, where her ability to get what she wants improves over time, the goal of a successful, intimate relationship seems as distant now as it ever did. To get to the outcome she wants, she'll have to discover what caused her to sabotage her previous relationships. To solve her puzzle, she has to understand why she repeatedly jumps to the conclusion that her partner is going to abandon her. Based on this one personal research tool, our first hypothesis of the premise that biases or prejudices her interpretation is circled in blue. After several uses of the personal research tool, she'll develop a better understanding of what goes on in the space between the things that happen and her reaction. Now she knows herself to the extent that she understands what causes her to react as she does. Personal research is the way to acquire this knowledge. A byproduct of doing the personal research is developing the skill to intentionally shift your perspective.